Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization. Today, we will be looking at the Renaissance, and this will be covering the years 1400 until 1517. So grab a pen, a paper, a tablet, or keyboard, and let's begin. When we last left off, we had looked at the disasters of the 14th century, sometimes called the 14th century crisis. And this was a period marked by plague, the Black Death, revolt, as in peasant revolts, civic unrest. We looked at schism. The church broke apart for several years. And the 100 Years' War dominated most of the century and beyond. And so as we move into the 15th century now, the 1400s, we're looking at a world that's trying to put itself back together in many ways. Old sources of authority are either damaged or discredited. The idea of a universal church, of course, was harmed by over a century of turmoil. The feudal hierarchy was breaking down, especially in places like Italy. And the 100 Years' War and miseries caused by that had even done a lot to undermine the idea of sacral kingship, the idea that the king was somehow chosen by God. And so the old order was gone. And so something new would need to take its place. And it would be in the city of Florence in Italy that this new model would begin to emerge. And in many ways, this model that's pioneered goes back to Cosimo de' Medici. In 1429, Cosimo had become head of the family firm. He was born to a father who had survived the chaos of the previous century. And this father passed on to his son no title. The Medici were not nobility, nor a castle, nor any vassals or anything like that. But what he did pass on was a ledger, a book where Cosimo would keep track of the debts owed to him by kings, cities, and popes. And Cosimo would use his wealth to begin to pioneer a new model of power that didn't rely on being a feudal noble. He would pioneer a model that used urban wealth and political patronage. Cosimo's ledger would undermine a new kind of power, one that would remake Western civilization and set off a renaissance of the European consciousness. And so the central question that this lecture will seek to understand and to make clear is, what was this new method pioneered in Florence? When tradition and authority have failed, how can elites manufacture a new form of authority? The answer that Cosimo and his contemporaries discovered drew on classical learning, art, and humanist scholarship. And they would forge this into a new tool, humanist culture. And they would deploy it in the service of a new strategy, cultural legitimacy. But what would begin in Florence as an urban solution would soon spread across Italy and reach its highest stakes in the capital of Christendom itself, in Rome. And so now we turn to that story. And so in telling this story, we need to start with the recovery that was taking place all across Italy in the 15th century. Italian cities recovered much more quickly than cities in other parts of the world. Surplus capital brought in by the banking trade, Italy's productive industries, and its productive agricultural sector was able to generate surplus capital. And so the cities of Italy would have been full of money, but what they lacked was feudal standing, a place in the feudal hierarchy. And a new elite was emerging. These were people who had surplus money. These would have been the bourgeoisie, or the grand bourgeoisie, the merchants, the bankers, and the urban professionals. These people lacked traditional status markers of birth, title, and land. They were immensely wealthy, but they don't fit into the old categories. They were neither clergy, nor lord, nor peasant. And the presence of their wealth was a real paradox for contemporaries at the time. It seemed that they could buy everything except legitimacy and institutional standing in the Europe of the 1400s. And so the solution that emerged from this situation, from these merchants, particularly in places like Florence, was to become a patron. That is, to turn liquid capital, to turn their cash into social status. Fund a chapel, and the church records your piety and prays for your soul. Build a palace. The nobility recognizes your refinement and receives your hospitality. Endow a library, and your civic peers see a man fit to sit on a council and govern. And so patronage could turn wealth. Patronage, the funding of civic architecture or art or scholars, could turn wealth into visible standing. And so the merchant's ledger would become a new type of power. And so let's turn to this new symbolic power. Patronage would expand beyond Florence, where it was developed in its fullest. Urban elites in princely courts across Italy adopted the same strategy. A palace could say something that a sword could not. A library could announce judgment, taste, and permanence. To build, to commission, and to display is to make a claim about who you are. And so a new social logic began to take hold. Rank and standing began to be attached to cultivation, to taste, to display, rather than to feudal obligation. And so the social ideal shifted away from the monk or the lord or the noble. And it began to shift toward an active, worldly, educated, cultivated figure. This was the status marker now. A man who can quote Cicero and can commission Donatello is no longer merely rich, he's excellent. And excellence is no longer inherited, it's something that can be cultivated. And so, along with this tide, rose people like artists and architects and scholars and humanist educators. These people were no longer anonymous guild members or servants of the church. They became the producers of prestige and urban and princely patrons. A new cultural market was beginning to take shape. Workshops of these artisans would have been filled with commissions. Scholars could readily find employment in courts. Culture became a commodity, and those who could produce it rose along with it. And so the artist was no longer this anonymous craftsman. The scholar was no longer a cloistered monk. Both had entered into the marketplace. And so a merchant could fund the chapel and increase his standing among his peers. But a despot, a tyrant, someone who had seized power, faced a different problem. They needed to make their power look rightful. And so, as the 14th century dawned, traditional power sources were very much hollowed out. At one time, the Holy Roman Emperor had been the arbiter of Italian politics, but he was distant and weakened. The Pope was no longer the moral authority that he had once been. He was bruised and battered from over a century of schism. And even the traditional nobility of Italy was in shambles. And so new types of rulers began to emerge. Rulers who were oftentimes mercenaries or condottieri. And these people would usurp power, and they would come to power, but then their titles would be shaky. And so, folks like the Sforza of Milan are examples of this. They had just seized power in this city, in this territory of Milan. And so it's one thing to seize power, but it's another thing to have people look at you as anything other than a tyrant or a usurper. And so these folks would also turn to cultural legitimacy. So a usurper, someone who had just come to power by force, who had really no traditional right there. They didn't have a lineage. They didn't have divine right. They didn't even have the distant emperor's blessing. And so what the usurper turned to was the same thing that the merchants of the cities of Italy were turning to. They used patronage as cultural legitimacy. Cultural legitimacy, of course, is the deliberate use of art, learning, and display to claim authority that simple force cannot alone provide. And so for folks like the Sforza, who are pictured here, the solution was to commission humanist historians to invent an origin story, to build cathedrals to announce God's favor, to fund university projects that would demonstrate your wisdom, and as we can see here, even put yourselves, commission artists and put yourselves in the picture with the Madonna and Child. These are the Sforza here, who are quite bloodthirsty tyrants, portrayed as devout, saintly people. And so that was part of the solution, was to buy cultural legitimacy, use it as a shield to give the appearance of permanence, of divine favor, of being a civilized authority figure. And so that was one use of it. The usurpers and the mercenaries of Italy would use this when they would seize these city-states. In many ways, the case of the Sforza in Milan was quite simple. They were usurpers who had simply seized power, and they were trying to make themselves seem legitimate. But cultural legitimation was used in a far more subtle way by the Medici in Florence. The Medici in many ways had a harder problem. Florence was technically a republic. It had a long tradition of opposing noble rule. It had regular elections, and no one person was supposed to rule it. In many ways, the Florentines prided themselves on being a lot like the ancient Romans, a steady and functioning republic. And so this was a harder nut to crack. But Cosimo wouldn't actually need to take power. He would just make himself indispensable. Cosimo would rule from an invisible throne, rarely holding any sort of high office, but making himself the debtor to everyone, making it so that every important building would carry his name, making it so that the scholars that he funded would write his histories and the artists that he commissioned would make his art. In many ways, what Cosimo and his descendants were going to do was a lot like what Augustus had done, to keep the republic but in name only, except that for Cosimo and the Medici, they would do it through art and patronage. And so, while officially holding no offices, the Medici wouldn't need to seize Florence. They could just purchase it. So whereas the Sforza could use cultural legitimacy to justify power that everyone can see, the Medici would make power no one was supposed to acknowledge, but everybody was supposed to feel as inevitable. Cultural legitimacy would work, but it needed a vocabulary, a set of ideas and images that could make power look cultivated and ancient and deserving. That vocabulary was already developing, and it's to that we turn next. Beginning in the late 1300s and early 1400s, a new intellectual model was beginning to develop. For over a century, the Studia Humanitas was developing in Italy, or the humanist studies. Men like Petrarca had gone around looking for ancient manuscripts and translating them and reading them. They had found a different model of human greatness based on ancient Greek and Roman ideals. And so these humanists pioneered new methods of study, emphasizing classical Greek and Roman texts, and especially focusing on subjects like rhetoric and history and ethics. They pioneered the idea of a new model of excellence. The idea was to produce an educated and worldly person, one who is capable of being an advisor, a ruler, a patron, and a citizen, a public-facing person, rather than the old intellectual model that had dominated Europe for 1,000 years of the secluded monk. Humanist culture would use classical learning and rhetoric and textual criticism developed by educated elites to define what excellence was and to legitimize new forms of power. And this fit into the patronage model very well. The humanist scholar was what the elite could aspire to and who they could financially support. And so as this movement spread throughout the princely courts of Italy, the university, and among the urban elites, a new system of credentials began to emerge. The mastery of classical Latin became a marker of belonging. Now you may say, wait a minute, I thought the church had always used Latin. Yes, but they were using medieval Latin, which is as different from modern English as the Canterbury Tales is. All right. And so yes, it's the same language, but the style is completely different. And so this mastery of classical Latin was a marker that one belonged, that one was an educated individual. Every Renaissance prince worth his salt would keep a scholar or more at court to signal to contemporaries that he was a ruler who got it, that he was fit to rule. And so the humanist vocabulary became almost like a type of Renaissance password to power. It began to replace the feudal bloodlines which had determined where someone fits in the hierarchy. This was different though, because it wasn't something you were born with, it was something that you cultivated. And so this shared language of authority became all important. A prince who speaks it appears wise and civilized, not merely strong. A patron who sponsored it appeared cultivated and fit to lead. To speak this language is to belong to the new elite. To ignore it is to look unfit for power. But along with humanism, along with its ideals of the worldly educated man, it also produced a method. In many ways, the watchword of the humanists was ad fontes, which is Latin for return to the original sources. Humanist scholars were trained to go back to the originals. Go back to the original Greek and Latin sources. Now, for the entire Middle Ages, people had read the classics. Now, it wasn't really anything new. Of course, through the work of Petrarch and some of the other humanists, many works that had been unknown were rediscovered, and that was significant. But what was more important was that the way that the humanist would read these texts, and this is very important, don't miss this. Humanist scholars were trained to strip away medieval commentaries. Like I said, for centuries, people had been commenting on Aristotle or Plato or Virgil or Homer or whatever. And most of the time, people didn't even read the originals. They would read the commentaries on them, kind of like the footnote version. Almost like students, well, not anymore, but at one time used to get the footnotes. But for these humanist scholars, the idea was to recover the original text and to begin to expose the historical distortions that have been added over 1,000 years. So as these monks and scholars would comment, they would add their own spin to it. And this proved to be a very interesting and powerful tool, going back to the originals. So for a scholar like Lorenzo Valla, he was able to prove that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. So let me back up. For centuries, the popes had claimed central Italy based on a document, the donation of Constantine. So it said, yeah, Constantine, one of the last of the Roman emperors, he had promised all of central Italy to us. But Valla knew classical Latin. He read it fluently. And he was able to show that, well, actually, no, the donation of Constantine was written in the 900s or somewhere about. Don't quote me on the year. But it was written in the Middle Ages. And because he knew his Latin so well, he could show that. It would be almost like putting modern language into the mouth of Benjamin Franklin or something like that. They just wouldn't talk that way. And if you knew English well enough and the way people wrote, you would be able to tell the difference. And so humanism wasn't just a cultural style, not just an educational ideal. It was a disciplined habit of scrutiny. But this habit carried a hidden danger. Once learned, it could be turned against any authority that rested on distortion, custom, or inherited privilege. It was a way of critiquing, and this would become very powerful and dangerous. But we go on. And we turn to Rome. The Pope, the papacy, was emerging from the Great Schism very much weakened, though now reunited. Its moral authority had been stripped from it, first by moving to Avignon and then through the schism. And so the popes made the decision to adopt cultural legitimacy. Adopt this thing that had worked for Renaissance princes and for the Medici and people like that. Use cultural legitimacy to reestablish their authority. And unlike a merchant like Cosimo, was very rich, the church had wealth beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. They could do much bigger and greater things than a Cosimo or the Sforza in Milan could ever hope to do. And so Julius II, Pope Julius II, determined to tear down St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He hired Bramante as an architect, Michelangelo to do the Sistine Chapel ceilings, and Raphael to paint the apartments, the papal apartments. And what they produced was a masterpiece. They produced the St. Peter's that it still exists to today. and it's still a masterpiece, an extraordinary example of high Renaissance art. And so the papacy didn't invent this strategy. It inherited this idea of patronage and humanist culture, and then it bet its prestige on it. But there was a hidden danger here, because papal patronage was different. Not many people thought much if a Renaissance prince appeared opulent and luxurious, if he was seeking after status. That didn't seem odd to people at the time. But popes were supposed to be the successors to St. Peter, the humble fisherman from Galilee. They were supposed to be the servants of God. And so this created a paradox. Rome became more magnificent, but it also began to appear more worldly. Splendor can look a lot like luxury. The spectacle of the vicar of Christ surrounding himself now with pagan gods and taking counsel from humanist advisors. The strategy that rebuilt the papal image was also going to begin to deepen suspicion of papal corruption. And the contradiction also had a physical element to it. Building monumental structures are incredibly expensive. Even expensive for an institution like the church. And so to finance the construction of this great and greatest Renaissance church, indulgences would need to be sold. Essentially what an indulgence is a way to purchase time off of your stay in purgatory. So according to Catholic doctrine, a person would need to confess their sins, but then they would still have the penalty of those sins. Now, you wouldn't go to hell because you had confessed your sins, but you would go to purgatory to purge yourself of those sins. It's true that one way that you could to lessen your debts was to go on pilgrimage, and many people did. Or to fight in a crusade, which at one time had been an option as well. But for many people in the 15th century who were concerned about their souls, or the souls of a loved one, indulgences seemed like an easy solution. For a simple payment, you could buy time off your stay in purgatory, which was an unpleasant place to be. And so the papacy sent out indulgence salesmen all over Europe and hawked these indulgences, these pieces of paper that would promise you or a loved one time off of purgatory. And so by embracing this strategy of cultural legitimacy, this kind of questionable strategy, the papacy was engaging in some pretty dubious sorts of activities. The selling of indulgences were controversial, even back then. And this was happening at a time when humanist authorities and humanist methods were encouraging people to examine authority more critically. And so Rome had imported both the language that glorified its power and the tools of humanism that could dismantle it. And we will see how this plays out in our next lecture. But I want to wrap this lecture up. So we saw the Renaissance solution to authority. The Renaissance attempted to repair authority by patronage. Men like Cosimo Medici and his descendants used the wealth from their banking empire to patronize artists, architects, and humanist culture. And in the process, they created a new way to define what excellence was and to project their power. This method allowed a family of merchants like the Medici to dominate one of the most important cities in Europe, Florence. It acted as a political shield for illegal power grabs by folks like the Sforza in Milan. And it served as a survival strategy for the papacy in Rome. The Renaissance then would attempt to rebuild legitimacy through culture rather than through lineage alone. But hidden within was a hidden contradiction. The Renaissance package contains its own danger. The same culture that could magnify power also trained scrutiny and to critically look at power. Ad fontes, or to the source, taught scholars to test claims against original sources and expose distortions. It might pose little danger to a Renaissance prince, but it was going to prove toxic for the papacy in Rome. The papacy had rested its claims to authority on centuries of questionable claims and inherited prestige. In embracing the Renaissance package, they had opened themselves up to the charges of luxury and corruption and worldliness. They had created a funding crisis that could only be met with indulgences. And so what had strengthened Renaissance princes' images was about to destroy papal credibility. Reform was on the horizon. The Renaissance movement that was pioneered in Italy was already fanning out across Europe by the dawn of the 1500s. Humanist learning was going to travel north, along with its methods of textual scrutiny. And the contradictions of the Renaissance were going to collide in a small town in Germany. The Pope needed to fund his project of cultural legitimacy through indulgences. But a German monk who had adopted humanist culture's critical reading of scripture was about to start a schism in the church and was about to tear apart the very institutions of Christendom. The Renaissance had begun as an attempt to repair a fractured world, but by importing these tools, the papacy was going to sow the seeds of its own demise. And it's to that we turn to next time as we look at the Protestant Reformation.